Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Terry Haines provides perspective now with Pangea Policy, definitive on LinkedIn with good summaries of what's going on in Washington. Terry, I think we clearly saw these confirmation hearings are different with the protests. How different are they when they finally get down to a vote?
They're not very different at all. You know, what I would take from the Hegseth statement to illustrate this, frankly, is him stressing his partnership with the Armed Services Committee and with the Senate broadly. Because as you and David were pointing out in the previous hour, you're going to have a defense budget that increases substantially under Trump from, I think you all said $850 billion to possibly to $1 trillion, and I've been predicting that for quite some time. You know, the question is his ability to partner. The question is beyond that. Isn't really so much about his prior life peccadillos or anything like that. Is he wants to be a change agent, but how does the change agent brief stack up again in a time where readiness in a multi-front conflict is the mission? In immediate readiness. And that's really what I think is going to get probed here more than anything else today. And
David, you alluded to that earlier.
Yeah, and Terry, I'm very curious about the picture the Pentagon that this nominee is painting. So he talked about readiness. He talked about the Defense Department's budget, the need to implement all kinds of reforms. How salient are those criticisms? How important is it to execute that when you look at the state of the Pentagon today? Is it suffering from difficulty recruiting? Is it suffering from a budget that's not big enough in light of the numbers that you just cited a moment ago?
David, that's a really smart question, and not because that's what interviewees say when they're treading water. I'm not treading water here when I say, but my impression is, I'm not going to be an expert on the view of the forces, but my impression from talking to a lot of people who are in and around the forces is that the first couple of paragraphs of Hegseth's statement are designed to appeal directly to those folks, the in-service people, the people that actually do have dust on their boots. There is great concern beyond recruitment about the mission, about what the priorities are, and whether or not, for example, other considerations, including diversity, equity, and all the rest, while important, have subsumed the basic purpose of the fighting forces, and that's what Hegseth's really trying to get at. So, like it or hate it, there's. Right. It's not coded at all. It's right there in the front.
With us, Terry Haines, and we continue with Mr. Haines with Pangea Policy, a special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance. David Gura and Tom Keene centering on economics, the finance, the investment, the market open now with the Dow up 193 points. For global Wall Street, I'd note the 10-year real yield, the inflation-adjusted yield, is enjoying 2.33%. That is a lofty level. We continue with David Gura and Mr. Haines.
Terry, I'm looking at how this hearing is being conducted, and there's some bickering back and forth now between the chair and the ranking member of this committee. Senator Reid of Rhode Island wanted to have multiple rounds of questions. Senator Wicker denying that request from his counterpart on the dais. There have been some criticisms here of the deepness or thoroughness of the FBI investigation into the nominee, into Pete Hegseth. Talk a bit, if you would, about how this hearing is colored by the majority the Republicans now have in the Senate, and how we're likely to see a response to that from Democrats on this committee and Democrats in the Senate more broadly.
Well, two things. Let me talk about the process first, and then the substance. The process, I think, is kind of standardized. Now, this is the first hearing in the new Congress. With the new Republican majority, Wicker and Reid are both pros. These are not people who have just come to power, just come to chairmanships, and Wicker and Reid are bickering about the process and about how things are going to work. My understanding of this is based on what I've heard, which may be a little bit less than you've heard, is that he's trying to establish, Wicker is trying to establish standard process, and the tradition is you start with the chair and the senior member of the minority, and then you work down the dais on both sides. On the substance, I think the Senate has insisted upon a pretty standard bureau process all along. There is a wrinkle here where the chairman and the ranker are getting to look at more of the FBI files than the rank and file in the Senate. I think that'll be a little bit controversial with the rank and file, but frankly, the reason why that happens is to protect against leaks. So I think that's a minor wrinkle here. Generally speaking, this is all being done by the book.
Terry, as you talk to clients, what are they asking you about the direction of this Pentagon, what that direction would be under a Secretary Hegseth? We heard him talking a few moments ago about what seems like something we've heard in the past, a pivot to China, a new focus on potential conflict there, that potential adversary halfway around the world. What do we know about the direction of the Pentagon, the direction of military strategy, what that would be like under a Secretary Hegseth?
Well, I think two things. One is I think markets are not quite ready for the degree of refocus from Biden to Trump on geopolitics. The last few years, geopolitics from Washington has been soft-pedaled a little bit, and I think that's going to change greatly starting next Monday, and markets are ill-prepared for that. So that's first. Second, I don't think we yet know, frankly, and aren't going to know from Hegseth exactly what new forms the doctrine and the strategies are going to take. I think that's frankly because that's largely up in the air, and what these folks need to do is get their feet under them and get their briefings under them because they're not fully read in and won't be until next week.
Terry Haines, I talked earlier about what President Trump's comments, and I'm speaking in a broad sense, of his upset over generals and admirals at the Pentagon, and I think Mr. Hegseth alluded to that in his opening comments. From where you sit, what is the divide between the brass of the Pentagon and the enlisted troops? Discuss that divide.
A lot of what you hear from the people below the brass, frankly, is concern about mission and focus, and concern that the brass are being pushed too much to be politicized, fair or not. But that is a real thing out there, and what a lot of what Hegseth is saying this morning is that he intends to kind of get back to basics on that and remove a lot of those political filters. So. Right. That will be, by and large, I think, thought of very well by a group the enlisted group and beyond who think right. less of the brass and are concerned about the politicization.
David wants to get in here. I'm going to be quick on this. Terry Haines, if we go from $800 billion up over $1 trillion in Pentagon spending, what will the new money be spent on?
I think it's going to be spent on two things: more of the same, firstly, and secondly, three things really. Secondly, on a crash basis, I think you're going to see kind of additional drones and unconventional warfare, and thirdly, I think you're going to see new weapon systems go through the process much more quickly than the current very drawn-out process that really is a relic of the Cold War.
You're listening to special coverage on Bloomberg Surveillance of the confirmation hearing for Pete Hegseth, the nominee to be the next Secretary of Defense. Terry Haines is with us. And Terry, I want to ask you, were I Tulsi Gabbard or Congressman Doug Collins, who was supposed to testify today, that hearing has been moved. What am I watching for? What does this hearing tell me about the approach from, yes, Democrats, but Republicans as well, to the president-elect's nominees?
I think what it really comes down to, David, is a test of seriousness. I think there's bipartisan concern, frankly, underneath the kind of partisanship, or Senator Wicker's support of Hegseth, for example. There's bipartisan concern about the ability of the Trump nominees, frankly, to handle the magnitude of the responsibilities that are in front of them. That's not a dissing of basic competence. What that is a concern concerned that their backgrounds haven't yet prepared them for the depth and breadth of these sorts of jobs, and may undermine the seriousness of what Trump's proposing on a defense and national security basis. So, these are hearings that I think are even more serious for future direction of United States national security and defense than you might think otherwise.
I will just ask you here, sort of where you see this leading after. Tom and we were talking about when the vote is going to take place. I gather it's been scheduled for Monday. Describe the importance of this role, yes, to our government, but to the president-elect, to get Pete Hegseth confirmed, what that means to Donald Trump.
I think Hegseth, the conventional Washington answer about this is that, all nominees are very important, so on and so forth. My sense of Trump is different. My sense of Trump generally is that, Plan A doesn't work, then we'll do Plan B, and there will be a Plan B. And you can look into his first term for this, but you can look no farther than how quickly Gates was discarded and how quickly the new nominee was put into place, and how much better everybody felt about the new nominee. They've committed to Hegseth. Hegseth hasn't disqualified himself over the last 2 months. That's important, and that's positive for Hegseth, frankly. But if Hegseth is confirmed, and my sense is this is very much a roll of the dice. If he's confirmed barely, and maybe with a Republican dissenter or two, and what that means for defense and for other contentious nominees like Gabbard and maybe Kennedy isn't good. But for the rest of the nominees, I don't think it matters a lot. They proceed to fail on their own merits.
Terry, thank you so much. Can't say enough about his coverage, and particularly, folks, go out to LinkedIn and see his complete notes. Agree or disagree, just always with terrific perspective. Mr. Haines, with a bit of experience in Washington.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app, or watch us live on YouTube.
My knowledge of the cabinet centers around the modern presidency of Abraham Lincoln. Of course, team of rivals, the political genius of Abraham Lincoln, Doris Kearns Goodwin, is iconic. And with picking presidents, Gautam Mukunda looks at picking cabinets. Gautam, how original would this cabinet be?
It would be original, as with everything Trump, completely unlike anything we've seen before. It's just thinking back the history of the Secretary of Defense, which goes back to the 1947 National Defense Act. I cannot think of a Secretary of Defense who is remotely as unqualified as Pete Hegseth. There's not even anyone in the same universe.
Bearing that in mind, describe the mammoth undertaking he would face if he is confirmed. So we talk about his unqualifications in broad strokes here as you bring them up. We see Republicans casting him as kind of a change agent in the mold of the man who appointed him to this job. What does he face as he walks into the Pentagon on day one, should he be confirmed?
Yeah, a change agent is desperately needed. The Pentagon needs to change more than just about any other government agency. The problem is, as we all know, not all changes are for the better. And so that's the concern here. But for what he wants to do, at a most basic level, the U.S. military has to reorient itself, not just from switching from focusing on fighting insurgencies in the Middle East to a high-intensity warfare, the old-school World War II style high-intensity warfare. It also needs to reorient its geographic focus to where we're fighting essentially in Asia as opposed to Europe or the Middle East, although obviously Russia is still a threat we need to think about. And warfare, like anything else, away games are a lot harder than home games. If we were, God forbid, if we were to fight a conflict with China over Taiwan, we would be doing it in their backyard. They would have every conceivable advantage. And so it takes a very, very differently structured defense establishment to make that work. And we have not made that transition. We have not even come close to making that transition yet.
We have heard for decades and decades this call to audit the Pentagon. It is an impossible task for anyone to undertake. But I bring it up with some seriousness here because when we talk about reform of the Pentagon, it's something that looms large. There is a lot of ability for us to kind of pillory the department for how it spends money and how it contracts. How difficult would it be to change the day-to-day of the Pentagon? Extraordinarily difficult. Many people have tried, and essentially no one has succeeded in the largest extent.
when I was in the Pentagon, advising the Navy, I remember I used to walk around, and in the Army section there was a big sign up saying, this was while we were in Afghanistan and Iraq, we are an army at war. And I thought this was the most devastating sign you could possibly put up, because what it meant was that you felt that people in the Pentagon had to be reminded, right? That's how different you are, how distant you are, and how insulated the Pentagon bureaucracy can be. The change that we're talking about, the Pentagon has more than 2 million employees. It has a budget, if you roll in sort of, affiliated costs of that, approaching $1 trillion. It covers the entire planet. No other institution in the world covers the planet the way the U.S. Defense Department does. And it has a civilian side sort of defense expertise that has really been eroded. One of the central reasons why contracting procurement in the Defense Department is such a catastrophe is that the program management skills that used to be part of the senior executive service were essentially driven out of the government over a couple of generations, where we instead shifted that burden onto the defense contractors, who ran wild with it. The biggest failure was a thing called concurrence, where we saw the catastrophe of the F-35 and the new aircraft carrier program, where they were built at the same time that they were essentially tested. And of course, when they failed the tests, all that building had to be redone, and it drove the cost of
Gautam, something like that, just as one story. Do you look at that as asymmetric, and that it was a Republican failure or a Democratic failure, or is that just an institutional failure?
It is an institutional failure. The two sides have failed in different and complementary and disastrous ways. Republicans have failed because they did not value expertise, and they kept slashing away at the civilian expertise on contracting, and relied on the contractors. Democrats have flipped on the other side. When Barack Obama was president of the United States, he could have made Richard Danzig Secretary of Defense. He could have put a real reformer in, and he did not choose to do that. Right? Like, there was a lot of, the Defense Department just isn't what we pay attention to. It's not what we're going to focus on. We're going to let it kind of do its thing without going in and getting into the details.
Senator Shaheen questioning the nominee now on comments he's made in the past about women in combat. Pete Heggs is saying that his main concern here is readiness on the battlefield. When you look at all of the things that are dogging him or could be potential hurdles to him being confirmed here, Gautam, how much does this loom large? There are many members of this committee, women who did in fact serve in the military.
It's a big one. I feel like the issue with Pete Hegseth is there are so many different issues with him, each one of which is individually completely disqualifying, that they're kind of blocking each other, right? Like, you don't want someone who has a huge drinking problem. You don't want someone who doesn't like women in the military. You don't like there's everything compounding all at once. I wonder if people are unsure where to target their fire. But if you were a woman in the military, surely having a Secretary of Defense who says you shouldn't be there seems like a big problem.
Gautam, we're going to have to leave it there because we've got to do a market over here. Thank you so much for perspective. I can't say enough about the book, Picking Presidents, Gautam Mukunda, Yale University. Thank you so much for that.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
One Christopher Smart just a moment ago, a former special assistant to the president who served from 2013 to 2015, now with the Arbroath Group. And Mr. Smart, great to have you with us. And I'd love to just get your thoughts on, yes, how this particular hearing has unfolded, but what it tells us about public service in this Washington at a moment of transition, the way that this nominee has been treated, is being treated, and the way that the president-elect and his transition team are approaching this process of advise and consent.
Well, I think at every new transition, every president faces a different environment and a different approach to this advise and consent process. I do think, looking at this particular nominee, and remembering all the way back to when President George H.W. Bush nominated Senator John Tower, a defense expert and veteran, who famously was rejected because of accusations over his alcoholism and again, what in the day we used to call, or was called, womanizing. This is a nominee. Clearly, I think when we saw the first opening statement from Senator Ernst, who seems to be sailing his way through to confirmation. And it's hard to see what is going to stand in his way right now, in spite of what are likely to be a continued set of
Right.
short questions from the Democrats.
Christopher Smart, you're one of the most qualified people. I mean, the title here is former special assistant to the president for international economics, but you've got a sense of geopolitics and the defense extension of America with your decades at Barings. And I'm not going to mince words, Dr. Smart. It's just as simple as this. Will the generals and admirals rally around this Secretary of Defense?
Oh, I think they will. I think most of them, wish that these political sideshows would go away so that they could get on with the business of defending our country and ensuring our national security, as they have always done through one Secretary of Defense after another. I mean, I think the real secret here is that no single Secretary of Defense is going to inflict significant change on the behemoth that is the Pentagon. One secretary after another has tried to make it more efficient, to make it more transparent, to get that audit.
Right.
It is not an easy thing, and no single person is going to be able to do
Chris
that.
Smart nails this, David Gura. This is the heart of the matter. The fact is the president-elect feels he can change the Pentagon. That's a fact.
He does. I think the open question is, and I'd love for Christopher Smart to chime in here, how much does he plan to change it, or think it can be changed, or force change on it? All through the morning, Chris, we've been talking about the degree to which there's sort of a script here for this nominee, should he be confirmed, to manage this huge institution. Do we have a sense from him, from the president-elect, about what actually, notionally, would change at the Pentagon were he to be confirmed?
I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure we've had anything other than we're going to make it better from the president at this stage, or from the nominee to be Secretary of Defense. In finance, the most powerful force in nature is compound interest. In Washington, the most powerful force in nature is bureaucratic inertia. And I think it's very, very hard for a single person at the top to change that without, real legislation and a thoughtful plan about how we're going to do these things differently, how we're going to allocate money differently, when everybody wants to have a finger in the pot and everybody wants to have a hand on the lever.
We're back to where we were a few years ago. That is, looking at social media for indications from the president-elect about what he might do. A lot of it is bombast. Some of it are policy pronouncements. Today, he indicates that he wants to create an external revenue service, as he puts it, to collect our tariffs, duties, and all revenue that come from foreign sources. We'll be charging those that make money off us with trade, and they will start paying finally their fair share. Drawing from your experience at the Treasury Department, we've talked a lot about the Defense Department, the direction that it might take. Your sense of what that looks like under a Scott Bessent, should he be confirmed here a little later in the week? I'm struck by how motley a crew it is when you look at the economic team that the president-elect has put together. Your sense of the direction when it comes to, yes, the IRS, perhaps the External Revenue Service, should it be created here by this president-elect, and the Treasury Department more broadly?
Well, the Treasury Department, as you may know, used to be in charge of the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard would collect a lot of these tariffs as ships would come into our ports, and tariffs were a more important part of our revenue mix. I don't think anybody who seriously looks at this issue believes that tariffs are going to represent a large part of our new revenue stream to cover any deficits that we have. First of all, if there is a tariff that is inflicted, that is imposed on a particular good, people are going to find ways to find an alternative. And so I'm not sure what the president-elect has in mind by creating this new service. Whatever it is, probably isn't going to move the needle very much.
Christopher Smart, you have parchment in history from Yale. I assume you had the honor of lectures with Jonathan Spence, the giant on China. And then at Columbia,
I have a book right behind me, one of his.
Yeah, I'm sure you're one of them, and you're the only person. I had the honor of interviewing him once with Orville Schell years ago, and I said to him, I've actually read the book cover to cover, and he said, there's only like 12 people that have. It was like 850 books. This is the giant Jonathan Spence on China. Christopher Smart, as Nick Burns steps aside as ambassador in China, your thoughts on how President Trump must address Beijing?
Well, must, or what he will do, or it's hard to kind of differentiate between the two. I mean, I think we in the United States and the Chinese government clearly have to figure out a new kind of set of rules for this superpower rivalry that is not going to go away anytime soon. And sort of as the United States and the Soviet Union did over the course of several decades, there were kind of rules of engagement, things we would argue about, things we would not argue about, that we haven't really set forth with the Chinese government yet. Unfortunately, it's not clear from the current incoming administration what kind of a relationship they want. I mean, it appears to be very confrontational, and yet there's this personal wooing of Xi Jinping that President-elect Trump seems to continue to pursue. So I'm not sure what they have in mind. As a country, we're still in the stage of really wanting to kind of wrap the Chinese on the nose with a newspaper and hoping they'll change their ways. What we really need to accept is that they're going to have a big part to play in our new global system, and we have to figure out ways to work with that.
We've got to get you back on. Christopher Smart, it's been way too long. Thank you so much for joining this special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.